Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and welcome to part 5 of our series on making a custom character controller in Unity. So for this video and the next one, we're going to veer a little bit away from making our character controller and dive into some custom editor scripts and some custom property scripts for our input system. And the reason for this is it's going to make our input system easier to use, more difficult to break, and frankly, being able to make custom editors is a good skill to have. I'm going to be the first to admit that I am not an expert on custom editor scripting, but I know enough to kind of get the system working, and so hopefully this will be a good, kind of starting off point as you're making your own custom editors. So the first thing we're going to look at here today is in our keyboard tracker, we see that we have these AxisButton structs that we made. Here's one, here's the second one. And right now they're just kind of structured in Unity's default system of lining up all of the or I should say listing out all of the variables that are involved. And we're going to want to make this something a little bit more concise, something like what we see here in the transform, where we have a vector 3 that's all three variables are all contained on one line with a nice label in that. So that's the first thing we're going to do, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video, because that has to do with what's called the custom property drawer. In the next video, we'll dive into actually making complete custom inspectors for both our input manager and our keyboard tracker, which is a little bit of a different animal, so I wanted to break this up into two different videos. So in order for this to work, we're going to look at our keyboard tracker script, and we're going to start here. And there's actually one other thing I wanted to do looking at this, which is that AxisButtons is kind of a confusing term, I realized, for this particular struct, because we're kind of referring to axis as one thing. Axis is anything with that float variable. And button is technically our bool being pressed or not pressed. This should really be an axis key, much like we actually have the variable named. So I'm going to go down to our public struct here, and I'm going to refactor this. And instead of calling it AxisButtons, I'm going to call it AxisKeys. And we'll save that, and we should see that that has updated up here as well. And I believe this is the only place we're referring to this right now, so that should be fine. Now that we have that adjusted, we can jump into actually making our custom editor so that this struct down here, instead of appearing as the two listed out variables, will appear in that one line. In order to do that, we need to make another script, and we need to put it in a particular place. So I'm going to go back to our scripts folder here, and I'm going to create a new folder inside of here, call this editor. Anytime you're doing custom editor work, you need to make an editor folder, because this kind of inherently tells Unity when it sees an editor folder, it goes, oh, okay, if I'm doing anything with the inspector or anything really in edit mode, I should probably check here and see if there's any special scripts that are telling me what to do. So we're going to open up that folder, and inside of here we're going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to call this AxisButton drawer. Now I'm going to open this up, and I'm not sure if they meant it to be drawer, like you're pulling open a drawer, or drawer as in it's drawing the property. I say drawer, I think, because when I read it first, that's how I saw it. But you might encounter people who say it the other way. So this here we're going to need to use. We can get rid of using system collections, but we are going to need using Unity editor, which is going to give us a namespace that has a lot of useful functions and stuff for working in the editor. We're also going to change this. It's no longer going to inherit from mono behavior. It's going to inherit from PropertyDrawer. And in addition, we need to put an attribute up here. We're going to say this is a custom property drawer, and it's the type of AxisKeys. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it again, I had changed this to AxisKeys, so I'm going to change that to AxisKeys here as well. AxisKeys drawer. I do have to jump quickly out and rename it here. No, it's not rename. I can just go double click it. AxisKeys drawer, so that we can stay consistent with our naming. Now it's going to disappear from here because that file name no longer exists, but I can go into, you'll notice that you get a new kind of hierarchy down here specifically for editor scripts when you create an editor folder. It doesn't appear in the normal hierarchy. So we can open that up, and there we go. And make sure those match. They do. So this is where we can create a custom script that's going to customize how the appearances, not of an entire inspector, but this one particular piece of information in the inspector. You can, adjust individual variables this way. So whenever we put in an access key, a public access key that would appear in the inspector, Unity now knows, okay, there is a custom property drawer of this type, access keys, so instead of putting in what was appearing here, I'm going to put in something else. Now right now you'll notice it's giving us this error. It's saying no GUI implemented. That's because we don't actually have anything in here. So we're literally not telling Unity what to do at all. We're saying, hey, we have this custom script for you, but we aren't going to tell you what to do. It doesn't default to a normal thing in that case. You would have to tell it to just do its default action. So custom property drawers and custom editors are really their own kind of class of scripting in Unity. They used to be how you would do all of the UI in Unity prior to version 4.6. Basically, anytime you wanted an image or any kind of, interface to appear in your game, you would have to use the system where you're setting these rectangles and then populating them with stuff. It was a very kind of code-driven UI system. As of 4.6, there's now this much more, what you see is what you get style drag and drop UI system that's a lot more user-friendly. However, the editors and the inspectors and property drawers all still use the old UI system. So we do still need to know how this UI works in order to make our custom editors function. And so, unfortunately, there's not a lot of tutorials on this kind of UI, and the documentation is a little bit lacking in my opinion. You'll find pages on all of the different functions and things, but they don't ever fully really seem to describe what they do. So there's probably a little bit more hand waving to this than I would normally do in terms of there's going to be certain pieces of information I'm going to put in that I'm just going to say I'm putting this in because it's how it's done, versus getting into more of why it's working the way it's working, but I will try to explain as much as I can as we go here. So the first part of all this is that we need to override the default UI that would normally appear. And how we do that is we're going to put in a public override function, void, and it's going to return void, and it's called OnGUI. And this is basically when Unity sees, oh, there's this struct, this AxisKeys struct that's appearing here. I need to draw it. It normally just goes to the default OnGUI script and says, how should I draw this? Now that now we have a custom property drawer, we need to give it an override OnGUI function. And we're going to pass in 3 bits of information here. The first one is going to be called rect position, and that is, almost think of it as like if you have a Word document that you're writing, or some kind of text document, you've got a cursor that is appearing and blinking on the screen, and that's where, if you type a letter, that's where that letter is going to appear. Your position is basically that same idea. Wherever position it currently is where stuff is going to be placed. So we're passing that in, so we're saying, if this is halfway down this particular inspector window, that's our position. This is where this property is going to start being drawn. Next we have Serialized Property. We're just going to call this property. And this is literally the data that we have. When we created this struct, remember that we made it a serializable struct called AxisKeys with this data in it. And that's literally what this is. This is a serialized property that's passing in the AxisKeys struct that we've made. And lastly, we're going to put in GUI content label. And GUI content is primarily, for our purposes, it holds a string that is the label that we're going to use, but it can also hold other things like, should it be bolded, should it be, a special size, other text information. But that's basically the label. Literally, like here, we see we have these button keys that are like element 0, element 1, element 2. These are the labels that are these were told, because it's an array, this is element 0, when it got passed to OnGUI, the label, the GUI content information here said, this should have a string showing up that says element 0. So passing those three things in, we can now actually get into the body of this function. So the first thing we do when we're doing a custom property drawer is we need to kind of bookend our property information with these two functions called begin property and end property. And that just basically kind of makes sure everything works properly, and it knows, oh, once we get to the end of this code, we're done drawing the property. So we're going to say here, ensure override works on entire property. And we're going to do that by doing editor GUI dot begin property. And this is going to take in those same three pieces of information. However, label and property switch orders for some reason. So we're going to say position, label, and property. And then once we're done with this whole, once we're done coding this whole thing, we're going to need one at the end here, which I'm just going to say end property. And it's going to be editor GUI dot end property. And this one does not take in any parameters. So that just basically says, hey, we're starting to draw this property, so everything is now going to focus on this. And then once we're done, it's all done. The first thing we're going to put in here is our label. So in the same way that we have these labels that appear here, we want that to appear first at the very leftmost side, the start of our property. So we're going to create this label using an editor GUI function called Prefix Label. And that does exactly what it sounds like. It creates this label that starts off the property. So we're going to say editor GUI dot prefix label. And we're going to put in three pieces of information here. There's actually, we're going to use this this system of parameters. So we're going to put in position, which is again that kind of telling this where it should go, where it should start. Then we're going to use a Gui Utility Function. And this is one of those things that I only do because I know it should be done in my research. And we're going to use focus type passive. And this basically doesn't let you select the property with your keyboard controls. You can certainly use, there's also focus type native and focus type keyboard. You can try them out, but this is the easiest way to do it. And then we're going to put in the label so that the label knows what text it should be showing. Now what we're also going to do, we're going to kind of do double duty with this. We're going to place the label, then we're also going to tell the quote-unquote cursor that we're of our UI that it should move to the end of the label. And we can do that by saying position equals this, because if we look at prefix label, it actually returns a rect. So what it does is it says, if this is currently your rect of where this is going to appear, and I'm going to pass you now what that's updated to now that there's a label here, we can shift this down to the end of the label. So that's kind of an easy way to, once you've added something, just kind of shift it down there, and it works a little bit easier for you. So we've got that in there. That puts in our label, so now what we should see here is when we go back to our inspector, we get both element 0 and element 1 appearing there. But we obviously don't have the information that goes with them. So that's where now we need to actually populate that, and we need a couple of things here. In the same way that we see up in the transform, we see there's a label X and then the input field, a label Y input field, label Z input field. We're going to want that here, both the label and then the drop down for the key code for both of these. So we're going to do that. In order to do that, we need to set a few positions for each of these things. So we're going to set 4 different positions here. Set position rects. First one be rect, and I'm going to call this pause label for the positive label. It's going to be equal to a new rect, and rects take in usually either 2 vector 2s, or you can put in 4 bits of information, and we're going to do the 4 bits of information style. So if we see here, put in a float for the x position, the y position, the width, and the height. So we're going to say position.x, position.y, so it's that basic starting position. We're going to give it a width of 15, because that's going to be a good size to fit. 15 pixels is a pretty good size to fit what we're going to use for our label. And then a position, and then we just want the current height of that rect. So that will work for us. Now the next one, I'm going to say rect pause field. And this is going to be equal to, and we're just going to copy this because we're going to keep on using these. And this time, we can't just have it at the same exact position x. We need to shift it at least the width of this, and then we're going to give it about 5 more pixels too, just so that there's some padding. So we're going to do x plus 20, so that's the 15 width of its predecessor plus 5 more. Position y can stay the same because it's not moving vertically. And then we're going to make this about 50 pixels wide, and position height can stay the same as well. I'm going to copy both of these because we're going to do the same idea but for the negative. So I'm going to say neg label and neg field. And now, once again, it's just, actually these are going to stay 15 and 50 because it's just the label and then the field, label, field. However, we do still have to now be adjusting for these different positions. So now it's moving 15 width plus 5 plus another 50 width plus another 5. So we'll say plus 75. And then we're moving another 15 over and another 5. So we can make this 95, I believe. That will work. Save that there. And so this isn't actually going to appear as anything in our editor yet, because this is just saying the information. Now we can use these rects and say this thing should be appearing in this rectangle on the UI. We also need to set what our labels, what we want them to be, because right now, if we had them populate in here, they would say the whole word positive and then a field, negative and then a field, and that's a lot of space here, whereas like here we've got this nice X, Y, Z. So I'm thinking what we can do for positive, just use a plus sign, and negative, just use a negative sign. So we're going to say set labels. And these, in order to set a label, what we're going to use is what's called a GUI content. Similar to up here, we have this GUI content label that's passing in element 0, element 1, etc. This one is going to pass in, for our positive GUI, we're going to say new GUI content. And this, we're just going to pass in a string. All this is just almost a wrapper to contain this string information, which is just going to be, for positive, it's going to be plus. And then GUI content negative GUI is going to equal new GUI content and a minus sign. So, with all of this information, all of this here, we can now actually draw these fields. And so we're going to do that. I'm going to say draw fields. And we're going to create 4 separate fields for this. We're going to create 2 label fields and 2 property fields. There are things like there's a drop-down field that would have a label and a drop-down for you, but the positioning of it gets really funky, I find, especially when you're trying to put in a custom label for it. So it's just easier to put in 2 separate labels and 2 separate fields to make all this appear. So we're going to say editor GUI.label field. And this takes in the rect, that is where it should be, and the GUI content, which is its position. So it's literally this information here and this information here. So we can say pause label for the position and pause GUI for the GUI content that we're putting in. Next, we're going to put in a property field. editor GUI.property field. And property fields are kind of like a all-purpose, because we're using a custom property that we created, there are fields for things like ints and floats and things like that. But this one, because we've made it custom, we need to give it this property field instead, because it's a little bit more flexible for us. And we're going to pass this in the pause field for its rect. We need to give it a property. And so in order to give it the property, we're actually going to pass in, we're going to say property.find property relative, and we're going to give it the name positive. And what this is doing is saying you have this property, AxisKeys, now find positive, because that's the specific thing, that's the specific drop down we're going to put into this now, is the key code for positive. And then lastly, we're going to say GUI content.none, because we're putting in the label separately here. We don't want it to have a label. So we're going to copy those, and we are going to change this to the negative label and negative GUI, and then negative field, and change this to negative. Now we can jump back over to here, and we see that this is mostly working. However, our labels are not appearing, and the reason for this is that there's actually this space is a little bit tighter than we're ultimately going to want it to be, because I'm actually going to make it so that this doesn't indent in here. The indent that occurs here is mostly because we have this drop down, and we're ultimately going to make this keyboard tracker not have these drop downs. It's not going to work like a normal array does. So we don't need this extra space here. So let's get rid of that. We can jump back to MonoDevelop. And to do that, we're going to go back up right after our property begins. And I'm going to say don't indent. And so we're going to set an int called indent equal to the editor GUI.indent level. And the reason we're saving this is so that we can, once we're done in the property, we can set it back to the normal indent level. Otherwise, it will continue to affect the rest of the whatever our editor window is. But then we're going to say editor GUI.indent level equals 0. So that's just going to kind of reset everything and push it all back to the start. And then we just need to make sure at the very end here we do say reset indent, and just say editor GUI.indent level equals what we saved as indent. So now when we flip back over to the inspector, we'll see that those two structs kind of push over a little bit, and we now have room for those labels to appear. And there we go. Now we see we have their main labels, but plus we also have that positive and negative sign for the positive and negative sides of the axis. So with that, I believe we have done everything we need to do for our custom drawer. It's a lot of code, almost 40 lines of code, just to get a single line of information to appear here. But like I say, rather than having multiple kind of parented lines of information for just one element like this, now we have it all conveniently here in one space, so that we can quickly and easily see, oh, this is this element, these are the information I need. With all that said, it would be nice if we could make this adjust a little bit more, and what we're going to get into in our next video is how we can set it up so that these two actual inspectors, or these two components in the inspector, dynamically work together. If I drag this, it should automatically change the number of axes and buttons that appear here. And B, I want this to I don't want this to be able to change. I don't want to be able to set, here and go 4 and reset the number of elements in here and suddenly change it from what the input manager is saying. I want to be able to get rid of that and kind of clean up and make this look a little bit better, frankly, in terms of the appearance of all this, rather than just using it as two simple arrays. So in our next video, we're going to get into making custom editors for those two components and really kind of make the system a little bit tighter and work a little bit better for us. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.